as you can see here, I think most are probably familiar with LGB at least. So L, of course, standing for lesbian, which is someone attracted, a woman attracted to a woman. Then we have gay, which is attraction of a man for other men. Bisexual, which recently has changed. Typically, historically, that has been used to describe someone who's attracted to both men and women. But we've recently kind of redefined it, and now it is more to describe attraction to your own gender as well as another gender. So the way that it was defined before was very limiting and uninclusive of our trans and non-binary friends. So now it has been redefined. Then we have T, transgender, which is defined as a gender identity different than the one given at birth. So we all know that, we're born, the doctor takes a look at our outside genitalia and determines female or male. In most cases, there are, of course, which we'll get to, intersex people who sometimes it's ambiguous. But yeah, so being transgender is where, you're given that one identity at birth. However, then at some point, you start to feel like that really doesn't jive with you. That's not how you feel about yourself, how you view yourself, and how you want to present yourself to the world. Then we have Q, which stand interchangeable, queer or questioning. We put queer on here though, because that is more of a solid identity, whereas questioning obviously is not. You're in the questioning stage. You're unsure maybe, and considering what your identity might be, whether that's your gender identity or your identity in terms of your sexual orientation. But queer is defined as otherwise not identifying as cisgender and or straight or heterosexual. So the identity of queer can pertain to either one, either your gender identity or your sexual orientation, or it could be both. Then there's intersex, which we just briefly mentioned, which is born with sex characteristics not conforming to male or female. So again, there's maybe some ambiguity there. It's maybe not super clear based on physical outward appearance when someone is born, whether they are male or female. They might have multiple different things going on. They may, outwardly appear as female, but internally they may have testes or something, something of that nature. And then A, there's asexual, which is experiencing little or no sexual attraction. So this is someone who maybe sex isn't a big part of their lives. They maybe don't often experience some of those feelings of like a physical arousal and such. That doesn't mean that they can't be involved in a romantic relationship and have intimate relationships as far as that goes. But maybe sex isn't a big part of it for them. And therefore, maybe the people that they do choose to get into relationships with, it's less focused on that. So next I want to go over the genderbread person. And this really just breaks down various parts of somebody's identity in the community as far as their identity, their attraction, their sex, and their expression of, and all of this pertains to both their gender and their sexual orientation. So first we have identity, and that's how you describe yourself. That's how you view yourself, what you see yourself as, who you see yourself as, and typically that pertains to your gender. So for our cisgender friends, typically you have this idea of, okay, I was born, with this sex, and that's how I identify. So for our cis friends who are women, they were born with all of the parts that we stereotypically consider to be women parts, and that's how they view themselves and go on through their life. Whereas our trans friends, it might be the opposite. They maybe were born with male genitalia and you know, got older and realized, nope, that doesn't work with me. I want to do all of these more feminine things, what we've decided as a society are feminine things, and dress that way, and so on and so forth. Then we have attraction, which is about your sexual orientation, and that's like who you're drawn to. And that can be sexual, romantic, either way. Because like I said, going back to our asexual friends, they're, although they maybe are not sexually driven in any way, that doesn't mean they aren't romantically driven. And then we're not going to get into this today, but, you know, even deeper than that, there are people who are aromantic. So maybe they don't experience any feelings of romance, and like those kind of deeper connections, but they are sexually active. Like I said, that's for a different a different workshop, but for these purposes, we'll just keep it at that. Then we have sex, and that's the physical traits that you're born with. So again, that's what the doctor sees when you're born and writes on your birth certificate, typically speaking anyway. But again, we won't get that deep, not in this workshop. Then there's expression, which is how you present your gender. And that includes through your actions, your clothing, your demeanor, your name, your pronouns, whatever you do outwardly that shows who you are as far as your gender is concerned, is your expression. And all of these things don't have to line up in a specific way. So your identity, you may identify yourself as, you know, a man. However, your expression, you might choose to wear a dress, which society, again, stereotypically and traditionally kind of sees that as a female characteristic and something that women do, and so on and so forth. But we are just breaking all kinds of norms and stereotypes here. So going into some of the different gender identities, we have, and again, there are more. There are ever-evolving gender identities, so that's why I just put some. And I think most of the ones here, maybe with the exception of agender, are ones that maybe probably most have at least heard of. So first off, we have cisgender, which is ever relating to or being a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex the person was identified as having at birth. So again, that's someone who, you know, was born, the doctor took a look and said, yep, that's a baby girl. And then they are living their life as a woman and all that that entails for them. Then we have non-binary, which is someone who identifies or expresses a gender identity that's neither entirely male or female. So they don't necessarily identify with that. Maybe these are people who are using they, them pronouns. Maybe these are people who, you know, don't necessarily refer to themselves as a man or a woman, you know, just a person. Then there are those who identify as gender fluid, which is someone whose gender identity isn't fixed. So this could look like someone who, you know, at some times in their life, they are, you know, all decked out in makeup and heels and dresses, and they prefer maybe maybe the pronouns she, her, and maybe even have a name that they prefer when they're kind of feeling like that. And then maybe other days, it's quite the opposite. Maybe other days they're in work boots and jeans and a t-shirt, and they have a more masculine name that they like to use on those days, and so on and so forth. Then we have transgender, which is a person who their gender identity differs from the sex that they were identified as having at birth. And usually this is, people can sometimes get confused with some of these, especially like non-binary and gender fluid and transgender and gender non-conforming, because essentially they're all kind of like, you're not doing the norm, you know. However, the difference here is that many trans folks, typically it's not as fluid, versus gender fluid. Of course, everybody has the right to decide to identify however they choose to, but a lot of the times those who are identifying as transgender typically just sort of go in the opposite direction. So someone who maybe was born female, then, you know, identifies more as a male, you know, as they get older and expresses themselves in that way, versus, you know, someone who's gender fluid where it's a little bit back and forth. But again, all of these are really up to that person. We might have someone who sort of presents to us as what we consider transgender, but maybe they identify themselves as gender fluid anyway, or non-binary, or so on. Then we have agender, which is someone who has an internal sense of being neither male nor female, nor any kind of combination. So this is pretty closely related to non-binary. Again, it's just kind of a matter of what works for that person, how they, you know, consider their gender identity or lack thereof to be. Then there's gender nonconforming, which is defined as exhibiting behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits that don't correspond with the traits typically associated with one's sex, or having a gender expression that doesn't conform to gender norms. So this one, again, is like another one that it kind of just depends on how you want to define yourself. And this one is also a bit of an umbrella term, because someone who's transgender could be seen as being gender nonconforming and might describe themselves that way. Same with someone who's non-binary. They might say, you know, I'm gender nonconforming, I'm non-binary. So it's a bit of an umbrella term. All right, so getting more into identity. Again, this is how you identify or describe yourself as far as your gender is concerned, sorry. So, you know, we just went over some of these. So, you know, we have people who might be a cis man, a cis woman, a trans man, a trans woman, a non-binary person, a gender fluid person, and there are more, of course, an agender person, so on. And I did make note that in certain cultures, there are more specific identities. So you maybe have all heard of two-spirit in some cultures and hydra in others. These are just, you know, the terms that we typically use in the US and how we kind of define them. So your gender identity might determine what name you use and what pronouns you use and what expressions you have, as far as, like, you know, if you're a, you know, cis man, then you might just go by whatever your birth name was and he, him pronouns, and you might just express yourself with like a short haircut and those sorts of things. However, your identity does not necessarily determine your sex or your sexual attraction, because as we know, again, with, for example, our trans friends, their sex typically differs from their identity. And as far as sexual attraction, again, that's one of those things that we all kind of get to define for ourselves. You know, so just because someone is a trans man, if that person is a trans man who is attracted to women, depending on how they define themselves, you know, they might consider themselves to be heterosexual because in their eyes they view themselves as a man. However, they might say, no, I really want to embrace that I'm trans and not a cis man, and they might identify themselves as being queer in some way, maybe even just using that term. So we have some of the different sexual identities. Again, probably a few of these you're all pretty familiar with: heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual. I won't bother to go over hetero and homosexual, other than to say that a lot of people are kind of breaking away from using the term homosexual because it's been, you know, previously kind of used in an offensive manner. So you kind of see that less and less now. And then I also did want to make note for bisexual. I won't go over that too much because we kind of defined that earlier. But I will just again mention that previously that was defined as being an attraction to both men and women. However, recently it's been kind of redefined and reworked to mean attraction to your own gender as well as another or other gender identities. So moving on, though, we do have pansexual, which is characterized by sexual or romantic attraction that's not limited to people of a particular gender identity or sexual orientation. So typically someone who's identifying as pansexual doesn't necessarily have, you know, one or two set, like, okay, I'm attracted to men and women, or I'm attracted to trans men and women. It's really not limited. They could find themselves attracted to any and every particular gender identity. Usually for those individuals, it's more about, you know, what kind of a connection do I have with this person, and not thinking about necessarily what they look like, how they identify, and those sorts of things. Then we have asexual, which, as we said earlier, is not having sexual feelings towards others, not really experiencing much sexual desire or attraction. And then we did sort of bring up aromantic earlier. So again, that's not having romantic feelings towards others and not really experiencing those kinds of desires and attractions, but maybe still experiencing sexual desires and attractions. All right, so expression. Again, this is how we present ourselves to the world, what clothes we wear, what accessories we use, what kind of haircut we have, how we maybe walk and talk, and so on and so forth. I did want to touch on sex versus gender, even though I think we kind of already did that, but just going more into details, sex typically is biological. Again, so that's the physical traits that you're kind of born with based on like DNA and those sorts of things. What reproductive organs and genitalia you have and your hormones and all those sorts of things. Whereas gender is a cultural thing. You know, in our culture here in the US, you know, usually things that we see as being for females and being part of the female gender culture would be having, you know, caring roles, service jobs, those sorts of things, being fragile and emotional, and this is going to get kind of sad, but unfortunately, you know, as far as entitlements go, in this culture, unfortunately, women have often been viewed as inferior to men and treated that way. And in our culture, men, on the other hand, have had roles that are more defensive, more about construction, building, those sorts of things, jobs that are, you know, that require a lot of strength, stuff like that. Usually they're seen as being risk takers more often and having more aggression. And as far as entitlements go, the opposite of women, of course, being compensated more and having higher positions and those sorts of things. So obviously you can see how and where these things might not match up, you know. You just because you're born with a certain reproductive organ doesn't mean that, you know, you can't belong to, you know, culturally a different gender, and view yourself as that. So I didn't want to make this too history heavy or anything, but I did want to keep in here a little bit of information about our history, and not necessarily our history, but rather the lack thereof, because something I hear pretty often is, you know, especially from older folks, is we didn't have all of this when we were growing up. You know, we didn't have all of these gay people or trans folks or whatever. And the reality is that's not true. All of those people have been around forever. They've just been forced to be hidden, and been hidden by other people. So they've had to hide themselves and be hidden from by other people. So a lot of us in the community don't even necessarily know some of our own history, and it can be tough kind of figuring that out sometimes. And the reason for that is there's multiple reasons, but some of them are that there's really not a ton of formal education in school about this community. There are a few things that get touched on for sure. Like I know when I was in high school, I definitely, we definitely covered like the AIDS epidemic and a couple of other things, that happened in the community. But for the most part, there wasn't a ton. Mostly we just learned about wars. um, so, and then there's also the fact that there's not a ton of history just being passed down through families. And that's for multiple reasons. One just being that maybe there's not much of a history there, or maybe, it had to be hidden or something. Like, I don't know, maybe I had a great grandfather who was gay and or whatever. But of course he's not going to tell me that. He wasn't going to tell me that back then, because again, not super accepted. Then there's lack of proof, right? So we have tons of diaries or pictures and whatever else of all of these other big things from history, because those things were safe to have. Nobody was going to question a picture from a war. Nobody had any issue with that. They're like, yeah, like, okay, that's a war that happened, whatever. Whereas somebody may be keeping a diary talking about their love interest of the same sex, that's not going to be safe for them to have around. So things like that weren't kept very often, or they were destroyed at some point, because maybe their family didn't want that getting out. Maybe those things were kept and then later found when that person passed or something, but someone was like, oh, we can't let this get out. We can't let them know that our daughter was queer or whatever. Okay. And then there also just hasn't been a lot of spaces for us to exist, to kind of keep some of those things going, to keep the education going, to keep stories of our history going. Mainly what we saw previously was a lot of bars and clubs, which of course younger people weren't getting into, so they weren't getting that information. As well as like bars and clubs just aren't really a place that you go and have, big talks in those places. Not usually anyway. You're going there to dance and to meet people and, whatever, for a good time. So a lot of those important topics and conversations weren't coming up and happening. Thankfully, that's starting to change, obviously, with things like this workshop and things like, organizations and agencies, creating spaces for people to be. So, all right, minority stress. So, this is so important to talk about here, because the LGBTQ plus community is obviously a minority. We're seen as a minority. And with that comes a lot of sometimes, detrimental things, such as, chronic stress and less access to resources and things like that. So, I'm going to go into detail about some of that stuff. So one, being reduced access to protective resources. A lot of the times this community is poor, low income. There's a large homeless population, LGBTQ population. And so with those things, of course, come other issues, like mental and physical health outcomes, such as, anxiety, depression, suicide, self-harm. So those are unfortunately pretty high in the community as well. And then physical outcomes, cardiovascular disease, decreased birth weights, increased blood pressure, physical injury, STIs, STDs, those sorts of things. And of course, you have chronic stress from all of that, and it all ends up becoming a bit of a cycle. You know, so there are stresses with being part of this community, including coming to terms with maybe your identity, how family or friends are going to react to that, and those sorts of things. So again, that ends up leading to psychological symptoms, negative coping behaviors, physiological stress responses, and all of those things listed there, as well as much more, you know. So that leads me into the Family Acceptance Project, excuse me, which is a project promoting family acceptance, essentially, promoting that we, you know, as families, be allies in order for us to have better outcomes, because that's really one of the big key factors in some of those issues from the previous slide, which is just not having support, not having acceptance, can often lead to those things. So obviously, with that in place, with the support, with the acceptance, then we're seeing better outcomes. So I'm just going to read this quote regarding the Family Acceptance Project. It says, half as many participants from highly accepting families reported suicidal thoughts in the past 6 months compared with those who reported low acceptance. Similarly, the prevalence of suicide attempts among participants who reported high levels of family acceptance was nearly half the rate of those who reported family acceptance. So essentially, this is saying that, you know, the rates of these things, the rates of, suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts are lower for those who have accepting families. In some cases, lower by half, which is a lot. That's very significant, obviously. So definitely worth checking out. There is a link here. If anybody wants these slides, you can feel free to email me, or this will be recorded, so, and then put up on our website. So you should be able to find it there. But we'll get to some of those things at the end. But yeah, so the Family Acceptance Project, they're pretty cool. They do research, education, and training. They have services for families, and get involved, attempt to get involved with policies, which is great. So they are worth checking out. So some do's and don'ts as far as interacting with anybody in the community, in the LGBTQ community. Some do's would be to respect the diversity within the community. And what that really means is kind of going back to what we said a few slides ago, as far as everybody in this community has the right to identify however they want to. So even though, you know, it might be that somebody appears to us as being what we would consider transgender, maybe that's not how they identify themselves. Maybe they are choosing to identify themselves as just gender nonconforming or something. And so respecting that, even though we have these definitions to kind of make things clearer for us, you know, we can decide, people in the community can decide that that definition doesn't exactly work for them. And so it's important to just respect that. Ask people their names and pronouns, and this goes for anybody really, not just within the community, but try making that a habit for everyone all the time. You know, you maybe wouldn't always ask people their name, but definitely pronouns. That's a good thing to ask, even if you think you know what their pronouns are, or you know, whatever. Even if it's a cisgender person and you know that, you are sure of that information, it just shows that you're open to those sorts of things. You know, if somebody sees or hears you asking someone for their pronouns, someone who you don't think is part of the community, then if someone from the community kind of hears that, that's going to make them feel more open and comfortable with you, and just let them know that you're kind of in on this. You're, you know that not everybody does use the pronouns or names that you would think that they would. Also research, do research. You can find out so much more about all of this on your own, and you should. I mean, obviously, again, going back to respect the diversity within the community, you're not going to get every answer about specific individuals online, obviously, but you know, starting out there is a good place. And by research, I don't just mean, you know, Googling studies on the LGBTQ community, but also just reading books or watching things from, you know, queer authors or directors or actors or musicians, whatever. You know, just get to know some of these people and how they present themselves and what they kind of need or what they're going through. Then we have use gender inclusive language, and we'll get into that a little bit more in another slide or two. But what I mean by that is using language that doesn't gender people, essentially, or respects the fact that there are many genders. So you heard me say friends and folks a lot here throughout this, you know, our trans friends and, you know, cisgender folks and whatever. And obviously those aren't gendered, you know, so if you're coming up to a group of people, maybe, you know, if it's a whole group of what appears to be women to you, maybe don't say, hey, ladies, what's up? Because one of them might not consider themselves to be a woman or you know, identify in that way, and so you could be causing them discomfort by doing that. Then we have explore your own biases. So what are your biases? You know, do you have any? We all do. Newsflash. But what are they? You know, where are you maybe falling short? Where are you not understanding something? And let that lead you back to research. You know, if you're like, I don't get trans folks, I don't understand it, can't wrap my head around it, you know, whatever else, then go back and do some research. Check out some trans folks, see what they're doing, see what they're all about, and those sorts of things. So then on our don't list, we have don't make assumptions, which I think is pretty obvious, pretty straightforward. This one may seem to go against your better judgment, but don't apologize when you misgender or dead name someone. So what I mean by that is, you know, if you're interacting with someone who uses he, him pronouns and you slip and refer to them as she, don't say I'm sorry to the person, because that puts them in a position to, you know, say to you, it's okay, which it isn't. You know, I'm sure that's got to be hurtful and maybe even sometimes traumatic for the person. So rather it's best to say, you know, thank you for correcting me, and then correct yourself and move on. So, you know, again, if you are interacting with someone and use, you know, he, him rather than she, her, then say, you know, if they correct you, then of course, you know, thank them, say, oh, thank you, you know, and then correct yourself and keep it going. If they don't say anything, but you catch yourself, you know, then just correct yourself and move on. Dead naming is when we use someone's name a name that they don't use anymore. So typically this is the name that they were given at birth, and put on their birth certificate, and maybe since then they've changed their name, whether they've gone through the legal steps or not. Even if it's just someone that says, hey, I go by this now, you know, that's the name that we should be using, not whatever, you know, name they were born with. And same rules apply as far as misgendering. So if you dead name somebody and they correct you, rather than apologize, thank them for correcting you, correct yourself, move on. And don't out someone. This one I think is pretty big and obvious, but it's never okay to out somebody, whether that's their gender identity or their sexual orientation. It is a very intense kind of process for people to discover who they are, and it can be a very intense and scary process to come out. And so we don't want to take that away from anyone, and we don't want to put anybody in that situation, you know. So if you know, one of your coworkers is a lesbian, you don't want to mention that to your boss or another coworker unless you know for sure that that person is out to them, because then that puts them in a situation of now maybe their boss is coming to them and saying, oh, I didn't know this about you, and now they maybe are in a position to have weird, uncomfortable talks with their boss. So this goes into detail about modeling inclusive language. I'm not going to go over everything on this slide because it's a lot, obviously, and I want to make sure that there's time for some questions and things. So, but just really quick, some terms to avoid would be homosexual and transsexual. Both of these are kind of outdated and historically sort of stigmatized. And male to female and female to male. Typically, this was used to describe our trans friends. And it's kind of viewed now as emphasizing the assigned gender over respecting the person's, now identity. So obviously, like with male to female, that kind of is emphasizing that, that person maybe was once considered male or whatever, and sort of takes away from how they're identifying now. Again, this is one that I still see a lot of, though. So this is one of those things that it really depends on the person. Then there's transgendered and transgenderism, which kind of makes it seem like it's a practice or an ideology, which it is not. So that's not the terms that we want to use. Using person first language is really good. That's definitely something that we should be trying to practice. Again, these are things that'll depend on the person. So if you have a relationship where you can kind of ask, like, hey, how do you describe yourself or identify? Those are always positive things to do. So obviously there's some examples there, like it would be harmful to say, are you a transgender? Rather, it would be better to, ask somebody, do you identify as transgender? Just something quickly to be aware of is making sure to put a space between trans man or woman. Because when we have them together, it can be kind of like othering and whatnot. I love the example. We wouldn't write gay man like all together like that. We put space between it. So yeah. And then, like I had said before, of course, just using those sort of those terms that don't really have a gender attached to them: folks, friends, buddies, partners, whatever. This goes in even more detail as far as using inclusive language. Just going to hit on a couple of quick ones here. Sexual preference. That makes it seem as though, this is just something that people woke up one day and said, oh, I prefer this. This isn't like, I prefer blueberries over strawberries. This is a deep part of somebody's identity. Same with preferred pronouns, same concept there. So just instead try to use just pronouns. What pronouns do you use? Not what are your preferred pronouns. Again, I won't go into all of these. So some tips for supporting the LGBTQ plus people in your life would be to communicate enthusiasm for their identity and gratitude that they shared it with you. This goes along with, expressing validation and compassion for their experiences, asking for their correct pronouns and chosen name if there's somebody who that's going to differ for them. Respect the various identities they affirm, even as they may change over time. So, you may have someone who comes out to you as being a gay man, a gay cis man, and then maybe a couple years go by and their identity changes and they're like, no, you know, actually I identify as a woman now, so I'm a trans woman, and you know, whatever changes might come with that. So just respecting that and not kind of going like, no, like you're just a gay man, like whatever. It's up to them how they choose to identify. Release your own fears and be open to learning. That goes back to our do's list. So figuring out what your biases are, and doing our own research and asking questions. Don't assume anybody's identity. You know, and that kind of leads into sometimes, you know, outing them, or even potentially outing somebody. We don't want to make any assumptions, you know, we only want to know what that person wants us to know, and we only want to share that with people that person is comfortable with us sharing that with. And allow them to define and interpret their own identity and the terms that they use to describe it. So I mentioned this multiple times throughout this presentation. You know, someone who maybe we think based on our knowledge of definitions is transgender, maybe they don't like that term for whatever reason, or it just doesn't work for them, and they would rather you refer to them as someone who is gender nonconforming. So here I have some resources listed. These are resources for various things. Some are just general support, some are informational. I have the Trevor Project listed on here. That's a crisis intervention and suicide prevention hotline/organization. I have a book on here, which I just learned about from Barbara from PFLAG. That's a guidebook on, you know, how to be a good ally, essentially. So lots of good stuff here, and there are more, although I'm always saying that there's not enough in South Jersey, because there isn't. There certainly are more than this, especially, you know, statewide and nationwide. So these are all pretty good places to do some of that research I was talking about and get some information on any, you know, friends, loved ones, whatever, who are part of the community, and good resources to give to them if you think that's you know, necessary, like the Trevor Project. So I definitely encourage y'all to check these out. Again, I'm happy to email this presentation to anybody who wants, and this is all being recorded and going to be put up on our website, so you can always go back and view it there. So yeah, that is that. Any questions or comments on it?